this.
All right.
Y'all need a pilot.
You know what? It's amazing. And to be fair to Mark Wahlberg, he really shaved
He
his
really
head.
shaved it. Yeah, not too bad though. It's a pretty good likeness.
But it's a
we're
pretty
from
good
we're
likeness.
from similar neck of the woods up there in Boston. So,
Maybe that's why.
But he's a Southie guy. He's a Southie. Welcome to the Old Brother Podcast. I'm your host Dan Smith. Alongside me, as always, my brother from the same mother, Mike Smith.
Good to
Gave
see
you-
you, Dan.
Gave you the double finger guns tonight.
Yeah. I don't know
I'm
why.
so excited to talk about this film. I guess
Me too.
I gotta say, let me say off the top here, Mike, we're going back to do a kind of a classic film here, which is actually legitimately a classic at this point.
1989.
1989, yeah, taking it all the way back. And so, again, talked about this on the show many times before. You're a heavy physical media collector. I am not. I've heavily moved to digital at this point. Like I'm rapidly, almost every week, I'm on Apple buying a couple more movies, off the $5.99 rack. As I said on a previous episode, you sent me this awesome player for Christmas to play some 4Ks. And the first,
Specifically for reasons like this.
correct. And so the first one that I got was, of course, Double Indemnity.
Hmm.
Oh, you don't have the poster up tonight behind you for Double Indemnity.
I did, and I switched it out with
Took it down?
Scarface. Yeah.
Okay. I don't see how either of those are maybe
No,
Scarface, but
nothing
not Carrie.
relevant.
Yeah, nothing really relevant. So what I said was, okay, I'm basically I'll lean into physical media, but be very selective about it. And so by selective, I mean like Criterion edition discs.
Yeah. Or
And
on that
so
level.
exactly. And so the second one I'm adding to my collection is the one we're talking about tonight, which is the great Drugstore Cowboy. Oh, look at that. We're twinsies.
Yeah.
So Drugstore Cowboy, directed by Gus Van Sant. And, Gus Van Sant, my top 5 films, we did an episode, very first episode we ever did on the show. The film has not moved out of my top movie of all time, which is Good Will Hunting, also
Yeah.
done by Gus Van Sant. So I'm thrilled to talk about it. And, Mike, as you said, October 20th, 1989, Drugstore Cowboy came out. And this, I can't remember because I was still living in Boston at the time, and I was like a junior in high school. So I couldn't remember. I don't think I saw it in the theater. And I feel like this was one of those you turned me on to shortly after I moved down here about a year later.
I had the laser disc.
You had the laser disc. So it
And
must have been, right?
this is like the first time I remember you and I sitting together analyzing a movie.
Hmm.
And
Right.
we picked Drugstore Cowboy. I probably picked it. We watched it, and then we went back,
Hmm.
and you had pointed out things. I was like, "Whoa,
I didn't see that.
yeah, he learned a lot."
Yeah.
Um, and we'll get into it as we talk
Yeah,
about it.
so directed by Gus Van Sant. It's based on a novel by James Fogle, who you can talk about a little bit with the screenplay. Daniel Yost, I guess, and Van Sant contributing to the adaptation. But and Robert Yeoman, who is the DP here, the
Yeah,
cinematographer, who
mhm,
basically has done, I think, every Wes Anderson film, right?
pretty much.
Out there, yeah, pretty much. I'm not
There's
sure.
a bunch
Like
of
going back to
shorts.
Bottle Rocket,
Yeah,
basically.
there's a bunch of shorts right now that I
Mhm.
haven't seen. There's a full-length movie on, Netflix
Uh-huh.
of Wes Anderson's work, which
Okay.
it's based on the guy who wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Oh, okay,
So,
okay.
yeah,
Well, and the Criterion disc, there's a whole interview with Robert Yeoman on the
yes,
disc, and he's featured in the making of, which was back in like 89, 88 when they were filming the movie.
right.
But I want to say, Mike, why this may, because I think you're right. I think you turned me on to it when I moved down here. The laser disc, et cetera, and kind of heavy into film at that point. Well, always have been. But in 1989, I made a note, Mike. Here's just some of the films that were at the box office in 1989. All right.
And I know
Just a
some of
few.
them.
I'm going to
Yep.
lead off with one we've done an exclusive episode on, which is, of course, Michael Keaton's Batman. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, starting right there with The Dark Knight, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which was the third in the franchise, the third installment in that franchise. Okay,
Maybe the weakest.
maybe the weakest, but then check this out: Lethal Weapon 2, Back to the Future Part 2, and Ghostbusters too. So it's no wonder Drugstore Cowboy didn't have a chance to rip it up. Plus, it's more of a, an independent type of movie. And it's Gus Van Sant's first feature film. I mean,
Correct.
Mala Noche, which I haven't been able to see. Wasn't that a short film or
I haven't
feature?
seen it.
But what they show of it in the extras on this Criterion disc are very striking. It made me want to go and see that film. I hadn't
Yeah,
seen it. But look at that, just what was going on at the box office, and we could use that today. I mean, there ain't
right.
been no lineup like that at the theater in years,
And
in
I
years.
remember really why we do this show is to turn people on sometimes to movies like this. And I
Mhm,
remember when this came out, Siskel and Ebert were just raving over it. Roger Ebert has 100 Metascore, if you look.
mhm.
And they said in the year, it was Ebert's number 2 for the year. Do the Right Thing, which I thought you were gonna mention, came out that
Oh,
year.
there
That
you
was their
go.
number 1, and
Right.
Gene Siskel had it at number 3.
Okay.
So, high praise. I never heard of it, but because of their praise, I spent my $6 or whatever it was then
Mhm.
and checked it out, and I loved it.
Best $6 you ever spent.
Yeah,
Let me run down the cast here. So, starring Matt Dillon, and I wanna come back to him in a second. Kelly Lynch, James LaGrasse, Heather Graham, a very young Heather Graham, a very young everybody, quite frankly, going back to '89. Is it Max Perlich who plays a character named David in this? He's pretty funny
yeah,
character.
which he was a swap out. They
Oh, is he a
originally
swap out? Okay.
casted another drug addict, and he couldn't meet the
Oh,
schedule or whatever because of
wait a
his
minute.
drug addiction,
Oh, well, okay. Well,
but he
let's not
was playing
infer,
the character of
but
Dave.
let's not infer that Max is a drug was or is a drug addict.
Well, I think
I don't think that's true at
it's
all.
talked about in the commentary.
I didn't hear that in the commentary at all.
Okay.
No, what they allude to is just I think Max was probably a little loose on the set, maybe up to some shenanigans, but I don't
Yeah,
know that it was explicitly said why or whatever. So let's
yeah.
just kind of correct for the record. I want to mention James. Is it Remar? I think how you say his last name.
Reamer,
Uh, who
yeah,
who plays Gentry because he was. I loved him in 48 Hours with
right.
Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte. He plays a character. I think he was Gans in 48 Hours, and he was scary awesome in that film. Grace Zabriskie, I think is how you say her name, who
Man,
plays Dylan's mom in the
mother.
film.
Yes.
And I didn't realize until after I had to look it up. She also plays the mom of a character on my favorite comedy, King of Queens. She was Spence Olchin's mom in King of Queens. So that was kind of a funny
I
and
think
then
she should be Ellen Burstyn's body double.
she really should. She
Doesn't she
really
look
should.
like her?
She does. And then rounding this list off, Mike, talk about William S. Burroughs.
William S. Burroughs, who was a legitimate, junkie in his day, is also a poet and a writer. And he's written several movies. A couple are on Criterion, and there's actually one called the Burroughs movie, which I haven't picked up yet, but it's always one of those ones when the 50% off sale, it's in my hand, and then I swap it out with something else. But
Right.
he only spent 1 day filming
Right.
all of his stuff.
Right.
And when you look at it, it's pretty interesting that they got it all in 1 day because they're in the park, they're in the
Yeah.
room, they're in a hall.
Mhm.
And he specifically wrote his backstory that Matt Dillon basically talks about.
Mhm.
All of that dialogue came from Burroughs himself.
Father Murphy.
Father Murphy,
Father Murphy.
Tom, I thought that was you.
Right. Or Bob. Bob, yeah.
Bob
Ye
is
Bob is
Dillon's
Matt
character.
Dillon.
Right.
Right, but that's what he's saying. "Hey, bad Bobby Jones," or whatever.
Right,
I thought
but
that was
Dylan
yeah.
calls him Tom after he says Father Murphy. He goes,
Right.
"Tom, I thought
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
you."
Right, right. Old acquaintances, old, dope fiend acquaintances. So, I wanna talk about Matt Dillon for a second because I had been a fan of Matt Dillon since I was a young kid, and right out of the gate, his first film, My Bodyguard, I think was his first film in 1980.
Yeah,
It was certainly the first film I had seen him in. Then he was in a film called Little Darlings, which I loved with
correct.
Christy McNichol,
I brought that up for some bizarre reason on the show before.
and he was such a and then, of course, he's in Rumblefish in The Outsiders in 1983, and he was just such an admirable badass
Yeah,
in those films,
and
this kinda
point out
edgy.
those 2 films are both Francis Ford Coppola films.
Yes, exactly. Right.
And, whenever a young actor comes along, happened with Timothy Chalamet recently, but
Mm,
they're always compared to James Dean, and Matt Dillon had to wear that tag,
yeah.
and he's the only legitimate actor I would compare and say,
I
"Yeah, he's got that quality."
I would agree, yeah. So he was just I always found him riveting on screen, he's very never knew what was gonna happen, it seemed like. It was always a little bit of danger there in his characters, and,
And
I
he
loved
he
him,
was a
still
bona
do.
fide star. They all
Correct.
other than Legros, and, the S is silent, so
Yeah, thanks
in
for
case
clearing that
I
up.
don't want anybody to send you,
We'll get listen,
uh
with a cast like this, it's probably like Graham instead of Graham, I'm
right,
sure it's.
but he was a bona fide star at the time. Kelly Lynch had done Roadhouse with Patrick Swayze
Mhm,
already, and
right.
she was kind of worried about being typecast as this kind of model because she was a model.
But that only came out I mean, it was the same year, so I think it came out just, like, months prior or something
Yeah,
because it was the same year. She was in Cocktail, I don't remember how big her,
I don't remember
part
her
was in
in
that,
that.
but she was in that and which was the year prior in 1988, but
And Heather Graham had done License to Drive with the Corey Haim and Corey Feldman,
one of the Coreys, both of the Coreys, okay.
both of them.
She would go on to have a huge career, of course, too. So, yeah, Kelly Lynch, and again, on the extras of the Criterion disc, which I would suggest people pick up, there's a great interview. It was so awesome to see Kelly Lynch. It was recorded 2024.
Right,
So that was a
specifically for Criterion, which is
yeah, it
why
was
you get this. Now, I
fantastic.
have the imprint version, a company called Imprint. This is the Blu-ray.
That's nice.
Now, they have an interview with her, but it's audio only.
Okay.
They show sequences,
Yeah.
and a lot of the stories she tells back I think it was in 2010, she reiterates in the
In
2024 just last year.
in this one, yeah,
Yeah, like, I'm holding on to the Blu-ray because it has a couple of interviews that aren't on the Criterion
sure.
Collection, and
Yeah.
that's one of them.
That's justifiable, yeah.
Yeah,
But well, one of the most fascinating things she talks about is her own struggle with being addicted to, opiates.
although I have something to say about that because I think she's a little misguided when she talks about being a junkie.
Mm,
She was in a car accident. She
right.
talks about it more in the original interview. She went through the windshield, her legs were smashed. She thought she was gonna lose her legs. She was in
Right.
the hospital for a year. All the drugs that you see in the film, she experienced at one time or another.
Mhm.
But that doesn't make her an addict. Like, once she healed, they stopped giving her the drugs, and she never used again. There's a difference between an addict and a dependent. And I know firsthand because all the drugs they mention, I've been injected with by a doctor or nurse, not by a friend.
Surprised you didn't have your, supply of Dilaudid up there behind you on the
Yeah, like,
stack. Yeah.
that's a drug that I used to get injected, like, every week.
Mhm.
And it does, it's for kidney stones, by the way, it's not for pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Mike
And
taking us down a road that, okay.
yeah, but I think she's a little bit she wasn't a junkie, she was dependent on those medications because of her pain.
Yeah, but I mean, the truth
It's
of
a
the
big
matter is
difference.
but the truth of the matter is you don't really know how long she was on these, and you
Well,
don't
she
really know the
talks about it in
okay,
more
but I'm
depth.
just saying you don't know the true blow by blow, so, you know, to I don't know why you're taking issue with that
Well,
particularly, but
I think because it struck a nerve with
Mike's like, "I'm
me.
here to represent all addicts, and I say that"
No.
She
It
is not a
struck a
junkie,
nerve
by
with
God.
me because
Yeah,
I had to be taught by a pain specialist the
yeah,
difference, because
yeah.
I thought, "They're shooting me with all these drugs. It's not good, doc." And he's like, "Well, when you have a kidney stone, it's pretty painful."
This is one of the things that stands out about this film, right? Is this whole theme throughout about this kind of effort that this group of, I wouldn't even call
Crew.
them friends, this crew that's together
Yeah.
just to collaborate on finding the next set of drugs, right?
Right.
And
And it
and
was very controversial when it came out because a lot of people felt they were glamorizing drug use. That's way off base if you watch the film. There's a lot of bad things that happen.
well, I mean, they talk about in the commentary, and maybe it's in some of the interviews too. I can't recall exactly, but to a lot of people, it came off as, it was very much an anti-drug, right?
Right. Right.
So,
Because
but
look at the terrible things that will happen.
exactly, yeah, and it's interesting because, this again, this effort to stay high, and one of to me, there's a line in the very beginning, the first second,
Mhm.
this jazz score that you hear, and this song, actually they talk about it in the commentary that the song you hear in the opening of the film was actually taken from a live performance from, like, the Tonight Show or one of the late night shows at the
Right.
time, because
It was The Tonight
they
Show.
didn't have any other performance recorded of it, and
Correct.
it fits so beautifully. It's this very kind of romantic, sort of soft jazz ballad, it sounds like to me, but in meanwhile, there's a kind of voiceover happening of Matt Dillon's character while
Mhm.
there's a tight shot of him in the back of an ambulance, which, comes to play out, and you understand why as the movie goes along. It's one of these rare films, right? Back then it
Carlito's
wasn't s
Way-esque.
yeah, right, and I wondered if Carlito's, quick side note, I had made a note, did Carlito's Way maybe kinda rip off the opening of that film
Very
from
similar.
Drugstore Cowboy? Very similar. In the voiceover, Matt Dillon says, "We played a game you couldn't win to the utmost," and the way he delivers that line, it's so impactful, and again, to me, it encapsulates the entire sort of idea behind the film.
I'll even do you one better. There's a scene where he's trying to get into a methadone program,
Oh,
and he's
yeah.
being interviewed for that's a program you detox off of drugs.
Mhm.
And he does this monologue that's so good. And he says, "You know what? I like it. I like the lifestyle. I like the whole thing. It just doesn't pay off." And he basically says one of the most brilliant lines I've ever heard is, "Most people can't predict the future, but if you're a junkie, all you got to do is look at the label and you know how you're going to feel in 20 minutes."
Right.
And that is pretty
Mhm.
stark.
Yeah.
And what else? He said, I tried to do that monologue when I was auditioning, like you said, the rhythm and the way he talks. You just
Yeah.
can't get that good.
He's the only one that could have
I
spoke
think
those
so.
lines. Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
said, drugs relieve you from the everyday pressures of tying your shoes. What a
Exactly.
line.
Right, and it's interesting because those lines, those type of lines throughout the film add this, bit of comedy to this otherwise sort of dark film, really, it's
Correct.
kind of
Like,
a dark comedy.
you laugh
You
at
do,
certain
yeah,
point, like
sure.
when he walks into a bedroom and he's very superstitious
Mhm.
and there's a hat on a bed. And that's one of the things, that's a hex. If
Right,
I see a
right,
hat on a bed, I'm gone.
right, it's gonna give us bad luck for 30 years,
And,
whatever.
that came from a film noir movie.
Mhm.
Uh, and I wrote it down called
Hat on a bed.
Shield for Murder,
Okay,
1954 movie. They
okay.
said bad luck if you put a hat on a bed.
Yeah, there's a lot of funny sequences in throughout the film, and there's times you're like, should I be laughing at this?" But it
Right.
is quite funny.
Right.
The directing is phenomenal, and what the guy did who did, like, all these second unit pickup shots, all these, like, time lapse shots they did, and then Van Sant has all of these weird close-ups of just odd things randomly right?
which when I talked about how we analyzed the film, you picked
Right.
up on one where he's getting beaten up by the cops.
Oh, did I point that out to
You
you?
pointed that out.
Oh, wow, I didn't know
He's
that.
getting
Okay.
beaten up by the cops, and Van
Yeah,
Zant's showing kind of point of view from him,
yeah.
and one of the shots is the cop's necktie, the
Yes,
just the very bow,
yes.
and it's
Well,
just so
and
bizarre.
what's interesting about that sequence is Dylan comments on it in the
He
commentary,
does.
but he doesn't pay it off. Like Van Zant never gets around to saying, "Oh, that's because," like, I wanted to hear a
Right,
little bit more about the damn necktie, you know?
exactly.
And there's another funny sequence that for years you and I have always called back to, which is this weird, to us anyways, it seems like this weird audio dub that they do when Dylan is escaping from a hospital where he's trying to rip off more drugs, and he jumps out of a window onto the roof of the building, and there's like these security guys chasing him, and they lean their head out of the window, and he's kind of,
He's got a
hiding,
crowbar in
and
his
he's got a
hand.
crowbar, and he just kinda whacks the guy in the head, and it just makes this really sort of silly sound that doesn't seem to fit the moment,
Now,
it's
was it
funny.
me, or did they change that on the 4K? It wasn't as pronounced on the
It didn't
4K as
seem
I remember.
I was listening for it, it didn't seem quite as prominent, no.
But the other thing that's really telling before you move on from that sequence is
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
breaking into a locker and he pulls out a bottle of Demerol.
he's
Now,
like, "Oh,
anybody that knows
Demerol."
drugs, Demerol's pretty strong. It's stronger than morphine. And he's
Yeah.
like, ah,
He's a
Demerol.
Demerol,
Like,
right.
I don't want that crap.
Right, that garbage. But there's one thing you mentioned, kind of some things that we picked up on, and I've seen this movie, I don't know, certainly more times than I can, can remember, but there's this time watching it, and I've almost watched it, twice through in the last few days because I watched it straight and then I watched it with the
I
commentary
did
on.
too.
And there's a sequence where they're all entering, all the main characters are walking into one of these drugstores where they're gonna, a couple of them are gonna be a diversion while Matt Dillon goes in the
This is
back.
right at the beginning.
It's right at the beginning, yeah.
Gets right into the action.
And I don't know, there's usually not a lot of accidents like unintentional things that are placed into a scene, right? Certainly not with a guy with an eye like Gus Van Sant. They walk in, so Heather Graham's character, Nadine, walks in to the pharmacy, and she initially walks over to a magazine rack, and there's a bunch of superhero type comics, and
Comics, yeah.
one of them is the Fantastic Four.
Huh.
And I just thought, I
That's no
wonder,
mistake.
that can't be a mistake. And then there was like the Avengers and Daredevil, like they were seemed very specific. And I thought, man, that's brilliant.
And
That's
then she
brilliant.
fakes a seizure for a
Correct.
diversion, and
Right.
Kelly Lynch steals a book. The book she steals is, Love Story,
Oh, that's a good one. Right.
which at the beginning, Matt Dillon opens the film with footage on a handy cam that they shot, the 4 actors
Correct.
shot,
Right.
and he
And let me
introduces
let me
each character.
and let me say before you finish that thought, they had, as Kelly Lynch mentions in the interview that she does, they had a rare opportunity to rehearse for like 3 weeks
3
together. So
weeks.
they were really tight by the time they started
Right.
filming, which plays out in the home video type footage you're talking about.
And I love the way Matt Dillon introduces her specifically. He says, "That's me, Bob. That's that's my wife, Diane. I
Mhm.
love her. Diane loves drugs." You know?
Yeah, it is a line, right, exactly, right, right. That kinda tells you all you need to know
But
about their
he does
relationship.
an introduction, but then Van Zant does another introduction on the scene you were just talking about when they first try to rob a pharmacy, because that's kind of a second introduction to what each role the characters are gonna play.
That's true. That's true. That's a good point. Yeah. there's a lot of great deleted scenes. I mean, there's like an hour worth of it deleted, or I would say extended scenes in some
Yeah.
case. But so that's it's fascinating, but it's a long watch. The score by Elliot Goldenthal is awesome in this film. It weird sort of off tempo jazz soundtrack that's going on. It really supports what you're seeing play out in the different sequences. This again, all of these weird attempts of them to get drugs, and and the cops chasing after Dylan and them, and there's it's kind of all this sort of cops and robbers type of situation that they've set up in the film.
And the slang they use is very accurate. Now, this although it was filmed in '89, it's based on the
Well,
'70s.
1971, and we should have said, yeah, set in Portland, Oregon in
Correct.
1971. Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's because the author, James Vogel, that's where he was from. He wrote this while in jail.
right.
He also died 15 months into a 16-year sentence for robbing a drugstore in Washington for 40 bucks. He got 16 years and died in jail.
And he probably thought it was worth it at some point. He might have, I
Yeah,
don't
I
know,
mean, I always thought this was an autobiography of him. It's not. And you
right.
hear Dylan talk about the character he plays,
Yeah.
that it's based on somebody Vogel knew. It's a fascinating story and a look into a culture that some people might not know exists.
It calls back to a time of movies that I think are just, for the most part, I'm not saying there's not exceptions, certainly, but for the most part, just are not being produced today. I mean, when's the last time you saw a movie like Drugstore Cowboy?
Well, ironically, in the span of like 3 years, we had Clean and Sober, which we
Mm,
talked about during the Michael Keaton episode. One complaint or nitpick I have is they never show these characters go into withdrawals, which happens to every drug addict, and it's brutal.
yeah,
But they don't show that, and they talk about it. They do this what's called crossroading, where
yeah.
they ship drugs in a bus to a city. So if
Amazing.
they have to dump the drugs because of a cop, they're less than 8 hours away from drugs wherever they're at.
It's interesting because of the four main characters, Matt Dillon's character, the way that he captured the mannerisms and some of the physicality of someone who's a dope fiend, a junkie, whatever you want to say, this tardive dyskinesia. I think I've mentioned this on the show once in the past for some other episode we were doing. This kind of involuntary movement of some of, like, in this case, his mouth, kind of with the jaw, and he's
Yep.
always licking the corners of his mouth, and it's really kind of fascinating, but these little subtleties that he brings to that performance are just, it's fascinating. There's another one, Mike, where he's making a deal with this kid, David, that I mentioned at the top of the episode, played by Max Perlich, and the kid's not so bright, let's say, and he's trying to figure out how much you're going to give me for these drugs, and Dylan's like, well, let's say 10 times 75 bucks, and then quickly Nadine, Heather Graham's character, corrects him, says it's 90, Bob, and there's this
The
pause,
look. Yeah.
and Dylan looks, and then he walks over. And again, you don't see this on film, right? Gus Van Sant taking his time with this sequence. Matt Dillon pauses. He walks over to this coffee table, sits down, looks at her for a few minutes. He's kind of smacking something on his fingers, just kind of like not saying anything, but you can
Right.
tell he's pissed off at her, right?
Right.
And
Right.
then eventually he gets David out of the picture, and then he goes off on her and, says he'll sell her to
And the
some
funny
carnival
thing,
freak for a pack of
right, I'm
chewing.
gonna sell you to the one-eyed carnival freak,
Yeah.
the first one I see, and then and he says it very kinda tepid, and then he looks at
Yes.
Diane and he says, "Look at me, I'm hysterical."
Yes, I wrote that line down because it was another one of those weird, quirky lines, like you said, where, we have to deal with the pressures of life, like tying our shoes.
Yeah,
It's just that weird sort of contradiction or juxtaposition. There were some use of, for those that like the technical stuff, some of these, and they talk about it in the commentary, some of the Dutch angles to sort of, create this kind of off-putting, somewhat,
we always use the old
uneasy
Batman
feeling.
show as a good
True,
example.
that's a good example. Yeah, exactly. I mentioned the jazz score, and then what I found interesting is the look of the film, the color palette is really striking. And I got to tell you, Mike, this 4K edition is unbelievable.
Yeah,
The quality of the picture is fantastic. But one of the things that Van Zant and Dylan are talking about is Gus Van Zant says there's a lot of greens, which is kind of taboo to a lot of filmmakers, but they embraced it because of that fact. And it was really their way of trying to shoot a black and white film. So the greens in this case were black, were kind of their blacks. And
Right.
I found that really fascinating from a filmmaking standpoint. But you mentioned too, Mike, the ratings on this film. What'd you say? Roger Ebert has it on his site as
100.
100.
Yeah.
So Rotten Tomatoes, the critics have it at 97%, 85% from the audience. I can see that only because, for those that maybe not have been exposed to it or just, aren't into this kind of independent filmmaking, this sort of
Yeah.
genre maybe. But IMDb 82 Metascore, it seems a bit low for
Which, if you look at the scores individually, I don't know how it doesn't the math doesn't add up,
me.
but,
Mhm.
the ones that were on the lower end really don't say anything to knock the film. They just
Yeah,
say, "Well, it was a good try," or I went and looked up Siskel and Ebert
the
because I
review.
wanted to see their review,
Right.
from 1989, and I got a best of, but they both, raved, and I think they should have because it's just such a good film. Now, what did it do
Great
at the
movie.
box office? Less than 5,000,000.
Yeah, no, on a budget of what, a couple of million maybe?
Probably. It must have been
Very, very
low.
small, yeah, and, I just wanna say, like, the disc I have one of them in the player right now, but you can
Yeah.
see some of the packaging, and then, there's this great booklet in here too that has a nice write-up in it, and it's a great, 2nd
I will
addition to my
say
collection.
the imprint version, which is Blu-ray, is quite good,
I
and
love that cover too that you just held up. I love
yeah,
that. That has always been the exact yeah, Mike's holding
there's
up
the
the
DVD.
the original cover, and that shot right there is taken out of that sequence you mentioned of the home video camera that they're kinda
Yeah.
using, and, it's really cool.
Now, do you know who was originally wanted for the part of Bob and Diane?
No, I honestly didn't know certainly for Bob, I didn't know there was any other choice.
Yeah, the first choice,
Wait,
Bob
hold on.
Dylan.
Oh,
Oh,
Bob Dylan?
Bob Dylan.
I was gonna say Michael Keaton.
No, Bob Dylan they wanted, and a lot of people
Oh,
wanted
man.
Bob Dylan to be an actor, but, it just
Yeah.
wasn't his
I
thing.
think I think Bob actually had the chops,
And
at the time, but
Diane, Patti Smith. So
right,
2
which is
musicians.
yeah, right, I forget, there was some reference to Patti Smith in the commentary maybe or something, and I saw Patti Smith in a club in New Jersey one year, which was amazing. She came out in a crowd and was, like, hugging us, and I mean, that was amazing to see
Yeah.
her. It was at the Stone Pony in New Jersey,
Oh,
an
wow.
amazing
Bruce's
experience.
Hangout.
Yeah, it was an amazing experience. I love this film. I've always loved this film. This is another one, Mike. To me, this is a perfect film. It's a perfect
I
film.
agree. And you know what, Dan? There's a cut of the film that they talk about,
Yeah.
especially Kelly Lynch,
Uh-huh.
that's horrible, apparently.
Oh, right. You know what, Mike? I'm glad you said that because I had made a note to say Mary Bauer, I think, and Curtis Clayton were credited as the editors. And I mean, kudos, I guess, because yeah, it sounds like it would have fell really flat.
Yeah, and I
Um,
guess Gus Van Sant showed Kelly Lynch the first cut, and she's like, "This isn't the movie
this
we
isn't
made.
what we
What is
did,
this?" And he
right?
goes, "Don't worry about it. It's being recut."
Yeah.
And then they both, Matt Dillon viewed it, I think, in New York, and she viewed it in LA, and they were both like, "Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
movie."
If you haven't seen Drugstore Cowboy, this is a major recommendation from
A
both of us to check it
must-see.
out. It's a must
If
see.
you're a
It is a must
cinema
see.
fan,
You gotta see this film.
this
Yeah.
has to be on your top 50 list.
So, what do you say if it's a Sophie's choice between the Criterion and the imprint version? What are we doing? Criterion, I gotta
I'm going
say,
with the
right?
Criterion. If
Okay.
you're buying it for the first time, the Criterion edition is definitely the way to go.
Can't wait
Yeah,
to
Dan's 2, and
to beef up. Yeah,
they're
what's gonna
both
be next?
10s.
What will be next, folks? Well, there you go, Drugstore Cowboy. This is one that I can't believe it's been this long since we've done or
And
before
I'm
we
so
got to a
glad
review on it.
because it
Yeah.
just came out last week.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
day you got it was the release date.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I
I'm
watched it.
glad we got a chance, and I hope we turn people on
Watched
to
it right
this
away.
great not drugs, but to this great film.
Right, leave that to you. You corner the market on
Yeah.
that, as you said earlier. And also this it's an hour and 41 minutes, like, by today's standards, that's a walk in the park, so
Right.
it's nothing, but
And
get
I wouldn't take out anything.
no, I wouldn't either. It's fantastic. So, there you go. Mike, as we're, closing out here, I wanna say, got a gift in the mail from a friend of the show, uh,
Oh.
who we just had on the podcast, and, it came, FedEx, I think, and, this will give it away, what the movie is referring to. "Y'all need a pilot?" So, we got this from the great Johnny Durango, who was, of course, the cinematographer on, the
Flight
movie
risk.
Flight Risk. Yeah, so we had him on the show recently and talked about that and many other things. I had been made aware that he had in his possession this little, gadget here. So, here, hold on, I gotta
Oh,
do
you're
this
gonna
for you.
model it.
I gotta do this, yeah.
All right.
Y'all need a pilot.
You know what? It's amazing, and to be, fair to Mark Wahlberg, he really
He
shaved his
really
head,
shaved it, yeah. Not too bad, though. It's a pretty good likeness.
but
I
it's
mean,
a pretty good
we're from
likeness.
similar neck of the woods up there in Boston, so,
Maybe that's why.
but he's a Southie guy, he's a South
Yeah,
Boston
so
guy,
you
so
see yourself in what, 2,
yeah.
maybe.
Anybody tuning in right now who may be on drugs or not on drugs, this is gonna be a weird outro for this
Yeah, what
episode, but
happened to Dan?
exactly. So shout out to Johnny. I appreciate the gift. I told him I was going to model it on the next episode. So here we are. But that's going to do it for another episode of the Oh Brother podcast. I've been your host, Dan Smith. Alongside me, as always, of course, my brother from the same mother, Mike Smith. And we will see you next time.